Today I want to talk about the inner critic. The inner critic is that part of us that's always saying mean things to us, like, you're too fat, you're lazy, you're not getting things done, nobody likes you, you're worthless, why are you possibly doing this? At least those are the kinds of things the inner critic says to me. And I resist that. I condemn the inner critic, because the inner critic judges me and guilt trips me and makes me miserable. But the inner critic has a purpose, a really important purpose. And when you learn to harness the power of the inner critic for you and for your goals, amazing things can start to happen. You see, the purpose of the inner critic is to help us to survive in society. The inner critic developed when we were little girls and little boys, and when we were small, our primary focus, our primary goal on some level was to stay alive. And society can be really harsh. What we see is that people who don't follow society's dictates get abandoned, they get ostracized, or even worse. So we learned to follow the rules. And the inner critic's job is to keep us safe by keeping us in line, by keeping us focused on what we need to do and what we should do so that other people aren't giving us that feedback. Now, unfortunately, the inner critic was developed when we were really young. So the rules that it's living by are generally the rules of our caregivers, of our community when we were children, not necessarily the rules that we want to follow right now. And the skills that the inner critic has in order to enforce these rules are also very rudimentary. They're the skills of a child. And so the inner critic it really wants to keep us safe, and it really wants us to have a great life. But it's not really very good at it. Now, one of the things you might notice is that there's a thread of truth in some of the things that the inner critic says. And I'll give you an example. I tend to think that I'm maybe a little rounder than my ideal weight. And, so if somebody comes up to me and says, you know what, Kat, I don't want to date you because you're too fat. Or you're a little rounder than the kinds of women that I generally want to date. I'm going to get upset. It's going to trigger me. On the other hand, if somebody comes up to me and says, Kat, I don't want to date you because you're too thin, doesn't really trigger me. So the inner critic knows our triggers, and the inner critic knows how to push them and to get us to do what it wants us to do. But in order to really work with the inner critic, in order to make the energy of the inner critic work for you, there's some things that you can do. First off, really, and this is hard, really think about how the inner critic has your best intentions in mind. And look at the inner critic as a potential ally. A good way to start with the inner critic is to have a little distance, is to really notice what the inner critic is saying. Observe the inner critic. Are there certain times of day that it's stronger, or certain activities that it has more of an opinion about? Figure out, what are the goals of the inner critic? What does the inner critic want you to do? What does the inner critic want you to be? So once you have a sense of the goals of the inner critic, then you can start to negotiate. And there are a couple really good ways to do this negotiation. First off, there's the good old-fashioned conversation. Just kind of say, hey, I see that these are your goals. I understand your goals. They're good goals. And let's see if we can do this a different way. We have a loving hearts process in the Loving, Living, Laughing program that works wonders for this in helping people to resolve issues with their inner critic. So let me give you an example. Let's take the example of you're fat, because that's one that a lot of people resonate with. Now for me, when I check in with my inner critic and say, hey, what's that about? My inner critic is wanting me to not extend myself, to not get into a situation where I have really high hopes and then have my hopes dashed. And again, it's dealing with my child self. So I'm much more resilient about rejection than I was when I was 5. And so when I kind of connect with my inner critic and say, hey, actually telling me that I'm fat and ugly over and over and over again is not actually helping me, because that makes me feel fat and ugly, which makes me, less willing to put myself out in the world, which probably makes me look more fat and ugly. So when I actually really have the conversation with my inner critic, I can come to a space of like, hey, let's actually work on a win-win where you feel like I'm going to stay safe and I feel like I can have some fun and be myself. So that's a little bit about how to work with the inner critic. And I think that you'll find that when you see the inner critic as an ally, it diffuses the power of the inner critic, and you can use that power to bring your life forward.